figure. It's a 3-week pose. Now, prior to this filming, we already had our first week. So in that first week, I opted to complete a shadow map drawing, which is intended to be transferred to the canvas. And then for this session, we're going to be building up the actual painting just by tiling it down in a window shading technique from top to bottom. Prior to filming, I completed the shadow map, and now we're going to do a demonstration on how to transfer the drawing to a canvas. We'll tone our canvas up, then we'll do a transfer, and then we'll produce an initial open grisaille on the canvas, which we can paint on top of in the next hour or so. So we can do this relatively close to when we're going to execute the painting. And in fact, we can even do something like this in Open Studio. Spend the first hour or two on a drawing, and then when the model's on break, go ahead and transfer the drawing to a canvas and start building up the painting from there. The drawing we have here, it's a seated figure, and we're going to transfer this drawing to a pre-prepared canvas. The advantages of doing the drawing first was that it allowed me to figure out the overall dimensions that the figure is going to be, as well as select a canvas and prepare a canvas that will be most beneficial to this dimension of drawing. This is, I think, a 20-inch tall, well, the figure's about 18 inches tall. So a standard size for this would be a 16 by 20-inch canvas, but if I did a 16 by 20-inch canvas, it would end up being so wide that there would be a lot of just empty, boring space. So this way I was able to create a canvas that is about an inch or so larger on all sides than the drawing, and I don't have to be confined to just standard measurements of a painting. Now, we didn't film the shadow mapping of this figure because shadow mapping demonstration was provided in the CDC DVD. So if you have any questions on how to get to this level of completion in a drawing, I would suggest you look back at the CDC 302 shadow mapping video. So first we'll start by toning the canvas here. Now the first step in doing the transfer is first to tone the canvas. Toning the canvas is optional, but I want to work this painting as if I'm working on a toned paper when we build up our drawings with white chalk and toned paper. So if I start with a canvas tone that's similar to what the toned paper looks like, I can work the painting in the same way. I'll have a brush for my lights, which is a little lighter than the toning. I'll have a brush for the darks, which is a little darker than the toning, and it'll make painting as relatively simple as drawing. So I'm going to shoot for a toning here that's relatively neutral. It doesn't lean any bluer or any redder or any more yellow. It's just sort of a flat gray. And one that's a value that's a little darker than what the lights are going to be in the flesh, and a little lighter than what the darks are going to be in the flesh. And it'll make it quite clear to figure out which paints I'm going to use for the lights and which paints I'm going to use for the darks. So to tone this, I'm going to mix up a batch of a paint that's got ivory black and burnt umber. Now burnt umber is a quick drying pigment, which is nice, and it also gives it a little bit of sort of a yellow reddish brown to the ivory black, and the ivory black itself is a bit bluish. So if I were to do it just a straight ivory black, this would end up a rather bluish tone, and then it would alter my perception of the colors as I move forward. So I've got a generous amount of mineral spirits in here. As I mix this up, you can see it's nice and soupy. And we're just trying to lay it all over the canvas here. And I'll actually let this sit for just a minute or so, and then I'll come back and I'll wipe down all the excess. And when I'm wiping, I can decide if I need to wipe and go lighter, or maybe I'll need to add a little bit more paint and get it a little bit darker. But at this stage, where I've got all the sort of soupy, slashy marks, it's kind of difficult to tell what the actual value is, because I'm seeing so many little dark specks against so much transparency in the paint. Now, sometimes I like this sort of splashy nature. When I'm doing open studios or any alla primo or impressionistic style painting, I like to have a lot of splashiness in the background, and that lets me step back and take measurements and not lose my place on the canvas. But since I already have the drawing figured out, I don't need any of these abstract marks to help me figure out where to place my measurements. So I'm going to try and keep it clean and clutter-free, and ideally just look like a flat gray tone on here as much as I can. The type of canvas I'm using for this is one I've prepared myself. It's just some canvas stretched over some stretcher bars. It's sized with a rabbit skin glue, and I pulled it nice and tight. And then on top of the rabbit skin glue, I have 2 coats of some oil alkyd primer. So oil alkyd primer doesn't really absorb paint as much as an acrylic, so this paint will stay soupy for a while. So the trick is going to be to make sure it's not so thin that I just end up wiping it all off. So I need to have a decent amount of pigment or paint on there while I go. So we'll see, I'll start to lift off some of the excess and maybe even out this tone a little bit. It'll always be easier to pull off some of this pigment and tone than it will be to put some back on evenly. Putting it back on will require figuring out the correct ratio of paint so it doesn't have too much thinner and thereby strip out what I have already laid down. Whereas wiping it off, I can just keep applying more pressure, going back over it more and more, and if need be, dip my paper towel into a little bit of mineral spirits. But I don't think I'll need to. I think this is a pretty nice tone, actually, for my painting. I'm just trying to get it as even as possible. Now, what I'm going to do here today is actually a charcoal transfer. It's not going to be an oil transfer. So this would apply to what we would do in drawing as well. So, for example, if we're in our drawing class and we've got a shadow map developed on white paper and we want to work on toned paper instead, we'd be able to apply this technique the same way that I'm about to do here to transfer our drawing to a toned paper and then build it up from there. A different technique would be an oil transfer. And with an oil transfer, I wouldn't necessarily need to tone the canvas. In fact, I would probably opt not to. And then I would coat the back of my drawing with a color like an umber or a burnt umber. All the way, I'd coat the whole thing with that umber. And then I would lay it on top of my canvas, and then I would just firmly apply pressure to any areas that I would want to be the dark side of the no-tan or in the shadow map. And I would actually lay down, the pressure would push the umber paint onto the canvas and basically tone the canvas for me and apply the darks to my darks, and I would just not apply pressure to the lights. And so I'd get a nice no-tan by doing that oil transfer. I've attempted to do that on a canvas toned this dark before, and the darks don't transfer over as well. It's really difficult to see them when you do that unless you're putting a huge amount of pressure on there, and I don't want to put too much pressure on the stretched canvas. So I've toned it this way, and I'll use a willow transfer. We're going to coat the back of the drawing, and then I'm going to lay the drawing on top of my canvas, tape it down to make sure it doesn't slide around. And then I'll just use a pencil or a pen or even the back of a paintbrush and just go over each of my lines to trace out the drawing onto the canvas. And that'll be an effective, quick way to ensure that I get a willow transfer on top of that. And since I'm going to be working in paint instead of a pencil, then I'll just be able to go over my willow lines with a little bit of burnt sienna or burnt umber, whatever I choose for my underpainting, and get a little underpainting on there right away. If this was a drawing, especially a drawing that I transferred onto toned paper, I would have to keep in mind that willow is going to come off very, very easily, especially on toned paper. It'll just brush off like it was never there. So it is something that you'd want to go over with a charcoal pencil, which has a little bit more binder in it, to retain some of your lines and make sure they don't get wiped off in your subsequent modeling of the form. So we're going to wait just a couple minutes for this to set up. Once it sets up, we're going to apply some willow to the back of our drawing. So the next step of our transfer is to coat the back of the drawing with willow. Just have a big stick of willow here. Same drawing that we showed earlier in the video here. And we're going to just cover the whole thing. Now I have a couple very large bricks of willow that I use for this purpose. I wasn't able to grab it just now. But this larger stick will do nicely. But I will go through most of it, just coating the back of this. So you do invest a little bit in willow to do this. And if I had wanted, for example, to save this drawing as opposed to just toss it after this is done, There are ways I could do that. I could lay tracing paper over my drawing, and this is what I would normally do. Normally I do a more extensive preparatory drawing. I get all the shading done and everything like that, you know, if I have time and if it's a large piece. And I'll do the complete drawing, and then I'll lay tracing paper over the drawing, and then trace my shadow map off of my drawing that has full structure, value structure, and edge structure. Then I would coat the back of the tracing paper with willow like this, and then I would lay the tracing paper onto the canvas. So that way I could retain the drawing to keep it and have it, and if I ever need to, I could make more tracings of it. If, for example, something went wrong with the painting, or I lost the painting or something like that. So I'm just trying to give it a good coating. And let's see, I gotta go all the way up here. I'm running out of my willow already. Now this will be very, very messy. As you can see, I am just covered in willow. But that's just part of the game. So now we'll get the canvas up here, and we'll turn our page around, tape it down, and trace it. Now we're ready to execute the transfer. So as you can see, I've taped my drawing to the canvas up here. Hopefully it will remain stationary and not move. One of the worst things that could happen during a transfer is for the drawing to shift halfway through, and then the bottom half of your drawing doesn't line up to the top half of your drawing. So we've got some tape on here. We'll try to keep it secure. Normally I do this laying flat, but I have it vertical for the purposes of the demonstration here. So we'll try and get through this and hope it all works out. Now I have, you'll notice the cane here. The cane is so I can rest my hand on the cane as opposed to the drawing. Anytime I apply pressure to the drawing, it's going to transfer the willow from the back of the piece of paper to the drawing. So I want to not press the drawing as much as possible, only press it where the lines are going to be. Secondly, I need to pay extra careful attention to be good with my transfer lines, my tracing. I'm essentially just tracing the drawing that I have on here. But you'd be surprised at how poor some people are at tracing. And it became relevant or apparent to me early on in the program when I had students trace their own drawings and turn them in with their assignments. And then so to save myself some time, so I could just lay their tracing over their drawing and see where it was off. And more often than not, you'd be surprised that students would let the tracing slip, or they weren't as 100% accurate with the lines. And so I couldn't use their tracings to judge their drawing. So I got in the habit of having to trace everybody's drawing for them. But tracing is something that you should practice, even though it sounds simple and rudimentary. But you know, a lot of time was spent developing all these little tucks and overlaps of lines and precise measurements. If I'm sloppy with my tracing, then all of that work is for nothing, and I'm just going to have to redo all of those measurements. So I'm going to go through this and try to be extra careful with my tracing and not obliterate the good drawing that I have. Notice also I'm working in pen for this transfer. I usually work in a different medium than what I executed the drawing with for the sole purpose of being able to make sure I've gone over every single line. If I go over this drawing with charcoal, like I drew it with, then I might miss a few lines because I'll think that I've gone over them all. With a pen, or so usually I like to use a red pen or a blue pen, I'll be able to clearly see which areas I did not go over because they're so different from the charcoal lines that are on there now. So we're going to use a pen, try to go over everything and get through this as quickly as possible. When I'm working at home and trying to be extra careful, this process can take me upwards of an hour or so for a drawing like this, because I'll be that careful when trying to do my tracing. For this demonstration, we're going to have to go a bit quicker so we can get to everything else before we have the model. And you know, if you're working in Open Studio, you won't have the luxury of an hour or two just to execute your transfer. So you are going to have to run through this a little bit quicker. So we're just going to throw this, keeping all of our lines straight. All of these lines are going to be obliterated. Ultimately, it's going to be transferring a willow line onto the canvas, and then we're going to be going over that with paint. So, you know, if your original measurements weren't 100% correct, or even if the transfer itself isn't 100% correct, there is opportunity to go in and correct this while we complete the actual painting. Keep in mind though too, depending on how resolved you manage to get your drawing, at this stage you may end up, like I'm having to do here in some instances, select which lines are the best fit for the drawing. I have some cases where I haven't completely gone through to clean up the shadow map. It's not 100% clean, so I've got a couple double lines in some cases, and I have to select which of those lines is the appropriate one to transfer. Usually I'm pretty good about it, but sometimes you make the wrong selection and then it looks a little awkward in your transfer. These sketchy lines, if you have too many on your drawing, can become a problem because essentially what you're doing is you're suggesting to the viewer that the true answer lies within a set of sketchy lines. And the viewer themselves will actually sort of pick out the correct line if you're relatively close with your set of scratchy lines, and then the drawing will look believable. But when we go to painting, we can't really utilize that technique because in painting you have to make a statement about where the shape is. And if it's inaccurate, it will look inaccurate, and so we have to be extra careful about that. I try to encourage early on in the drawing program that the students execute nice, crisp, clean, understandable lines. And then that way when we move to painting for something like this, it will be a bit easier to do a transfer. I'm also trying to work in fairly broad, straight lines like I executed the actual drawing with, because it'll be easier for me to go over my drawing. If I had a lot of curvature on here, and a lot of especially subtle curvature, it would be quite a bit more difficult and take quite a bit more time for me to be able to capture that correctly with my transfer. Because you have to remember also that this is one shot. If you make a mistake transferring a line, you don't erase it, because if you erase it, you're just going to transfer a whole bunch of charcoal into that area. So if it's wrong, you have to do your best to annotate in some way, or make a note for yourself about which is the correct line. Whether it's making the correct one a little bit thicker, or putting a little X through the incorrect line, whatever you need to do, but you have to be extra careful because it is a one-shot sort of deal. So these straight lines, and especially longer straight lines instead of a lot of little short segmented lines, are going to be more easily understood to yourself later when you go to do the transfer. All right, we're just working right on down the way here, going over to his arm. Keep in mind too, if your pen or whatever you're using goes out and you're not seeing a line being made, that doesn't really matter. As long as there's pressure applied, then you will be transferring the line. Another thing that can make this challenging is whatever texture canvas you may have. If you have a particularly textured canvas, then as you go to make this line, it's going to feel like your pen or pencil is just bouncing over the ridges. So you're going to have to do your best to be extra careful about that. I typically like to work portrait grade canvas or thicker canvas that's been primed enough to be a little more smooth. So I don't have to deal with too much of that, but I have worked on some heavier poured canvas, and it does make it a bit more challenging for this transfer, especially when you're working small detailed stuff. We wouldn't normally do a delicate detailed drawing like this on a super textured canvas. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We would only do a really textured canvas if we were trying to suggest a lot of detail, or it was going to be a really large mural size canvas, or maybe a landscape. The nice thing about the tracing paper method as well that we mentioned earlier is that if you end up doing all of this and it's a bad transfer, then you can wipe it all off and utilize the tracing paper and do this over again, and you will not have lost your drawing. The bad thing about doing the tracing paper transfer is that if you are continually sloppy with your lines, and you make a sloppy tracing with the tracing paper and then do a sloppy transfer off the tracing paper, it's like making a copy of a copy. And so your drawing could deteriorate in quality if you're not extra careful to how you're tracing some things. And, but the main thing is to be willing to go back and fix your errors. You know, if you do a transfer with tracing paper and you notice it's wrong, you know, you spend all that time doing the drawing. Don't just write it off and move forward. Go back and retrace it. If you're willing to fix those errors, then it will not have been wasted time. I do expect in the course of the painting, however far I end up getting, to actually be curving out some of these lines. So eventually it will become more finished and less of this sort of angular shape block-in that I have here. But I'm going to handle all that when I get to the paint. I don't need to handle it now. I would consider all of that refinement to be detail. And you see my pen is kind of going out here, but I am applying enough pressure for that to transfer still. I can actually see how it's creasing the drawing a little bit. Almost done here. Ooh. Drawing slipped a little bit. Luckily we're pretty close to being done here, so hopefully it's not going to affect too much. Just have this last foot to do. Okay. One last check to make sure I hit all the lines, and it seems like we're good. So we can pull it back and make sure that we got everything transferred nicely. Yeah, there we go. Doing good. Now, some artists will seal their drawing at this stage to preserve that line drawing. I don't opt to do that. I will want to just go right in with the paint that I'm going to utilize for my underpainting and go ahead and fill in the shadow map that I've established here and give myself a nice underpainting to be able to work on top of today in class. So now the last piece of this puzzle is to get an underpainting here. Now I have mapped out on here the shadows for the most part. Now I didn't use X's. Typically I use X's to determine or indicate where my shadows are going to be. I don't have those X's on here, but I think I can recall what was going to be in shadow, such as this area here and this area here, the shadow in the arm, shadow under the leg. Most of the face is in shadow here. So pretty simple to get. There's some confusion. I have some open gaps. For example, here, I didn't quite connect that shape. I do remember, however, that this is a light and the rest of this should be dark, so I'm going to have to close that gap. I also have another gap up here on the top of the pectoralis. I'm not sure if I missed that during the line drawing or if I missed it during the transfer. So I'll just close that gap for now, and I'll figure out what it looks like when I have the model up there under the same light. So we'll go ahead and get our underpainting in here. I want this to dry relatively quickly, so I'm just going to use a umber, just a burnt umber here. It'll be a nice warm color, and I'll have it thinned down with a little bit of mineral spirits to keep it a bit thinner. And then we'll just get over the whole shadow side somewhat transparently. And I'm using a sort of a broad, flat brush here. Usually with bristles, I like to work with filberts, so I can get little points in there. But I had this on hand, and this will work just fine for this. I don't need to get into any really finessed, detailed areas, so this should be acceptable. Now I don't recall exactly what the values of the model were. I just know that it should be a general dark, probably something around a mid value, or maybe a hair darker for the shadow side. And I can always add some paint to lighten it up when the model's there. So I'm just trying to get in the general ballpark, give myself a base ground to work with here. As long as it's darker than what I have for my toning, I'll be in good shape. So that's really my only requirement here. Remember, I'm going to try and have the lights of the figure be a little lighter than my gray tone, the darks of my figure be a little darker than my gray tone. That was my goal. The shadow shape of the arm was lost into the shadow shape of the chest. That's totally fine. I'll go ahead and lose that right now. I'll find it later again. And if I ever really need to and I don't want to measure it, I can always just lay my drawing on there to find that distinction again. But I do want to treat this like a notan. There we go. I want to get just lights and just darks in there. Because my brush is a nice firm bristle brush, and because it has a nice chiseled edge there, I don't have to actually use a small brush. A little brush like this will work for most of it, or a larger brush like this will work for most of this. Be sure his hair was dark. There we go. And we'll just carry this on down. Try not to lose those exterior contours that I developed last week, that subtlety of the oblique and the glutes in here. Get down into the leg. I'm not sure on this like what the triangle is representing, if it's representing a shadow or if it's representing a little piece of light. One of my students right now is suggesting that it's a piece of shadow. But it's definitely something I can make a determination for when the model's up there. It's not a very large shape. Foot's all in shadow down here. And, you know, to be honest, it is likely that when we get all of this set up today, since it's been a whole week and everything in the room has changed, the lighting is probably going to be a little bit different. The lighting pattern is not going to be exactly the same as it was when we started this last week. So we're just going to have to figure out what information on here we can be most confident is still going to remain accurate, or is usable versus what we should chase and change. Since I'm going to work this section at a time, I'm only going to have to nudge a few shapes at a time, and then the third week that we have, you know, I'll probably be down into the legs here, so I'll end up worrying about the shadow pattern more for the legs next week. But if I spend the first hour today chasing the shadow pattern, and then it, you know, changes next week, then I can spend the first hour next week chasing the shadow pattern again. So it's not a practical idea to keep chasing the shadow pattern. We'll try to get it as close as we can to what I have established, and then modify little bits as needed. All right. Got a pretty good no-tan there. And from this now, we should be able to use a relatively clean brush and start to drag some of the value from the shadow side into the light side. So I'm just going to take a paper towel, I'm going to wipe off this brush. And then just like we did with drawing, instead of stumping across from the dark to the light, I'm just going to drag a little bit of excess paint here using a clean, dry brush from the dark side over to the light side to establish some halftone here. And that tone is really, really close actually to the value of the canvas right now. So we're just kind of spreading a base tone, almost kind of just shifting the color of the tone from the light gray to more of an umber color, and just softening the edges here. So some edges should be hard, like the cast shadows. I can use my reasoning to determine which edges are hard, which edges should be soft. So that's a cast shadow, so that should be relatively hard, but it's more of a form shadow up here by the chin, so that can be a little bit softer. Top side of each of these shadows is going to be a little bit softer, because they're form shadows. Bottom side of the shadows are going to be a little bit harder since they're most likely cast shadows. So bottom side of that deltoid shadow there is going to be a cast shadow. Top side is a form shadow. Got a little dark in there. Just lift that up a bit. And then once I've softened these edges and spread some toning around, I can go ahead and lift out some of the lights, like I would do with drawing. I would take my eraser after I've done the stumping here, maybe lift out some of the lightest lights, the highlights. But the goal overall is to just give myself a basic underpainting that's describing the lights and darks and starting to describe the edge quality. And at this stage it should start to take on a lot of the form of the figure and start to look three-dimensional beyond just the line drawing that we had started with here. Maybe soft shadow there. And again, this is not the only way to start a figure painting. We could have started right in with our open grisaille. We could have started in trying to do something like this with paint. The danger, again, becomes in perhaps your figure getting too large for the canvas or too small for the canvas, or quite simply not being able to handle all of the subtlety that we see in some of these areas in paint. Because working with brushes, you're thinking more about shape and less about line, so it can become tricky to hit some of these really fine shapes that we have here. And the whole focus of that first session that we have in here is to give yourself a nice strong foundation for what comes later. So if you're doing a block-in with paint and you're so cumbersome with your brushes that you can't get the delicacy of a hand in here or the delicacy of a face that size, well then you've probably wasted that whole first session of your painting. And it's a lot harder, or it will be a lot harder if you're inexperienced, to correct all those issues while you're handling the color. So it may end up taking you 2 sessions to get this far if you start right in with an underpainting rather than 1 session. I'm just going back in and smoothing out some of the shadow side for the underpainting. I don't want it to look too streaky or too distracting. If I can at least get all the strokes in relatively the same direction, they'll kind of just fade away and recede. All right, and last little bit we'll go and we'll just throw in a few highlights if we can, or if we need to. But only if you remember where they're at. You know, it's been a while since we had this pose last a whole week, so it's, you know, I'm only going to estimate where a few of them might be. I'm not going to get too crazy describing them though. I just have some paper towel with a little bit of mineral spirits on here to pull out, and I was probably pulled out a little too much. But you can see I can start to suggest a whole value range and get this looking more like a full figure underpainting here, just by getting a little bit of this in. And you know, I'll just do a little bit here, and then when I have the model up, I can do this even more for just the first couple minutes to push that value range all the way to where I want it to be. That finger there. Basically any planes that I know to be center lights facing the light source. Those are the ones that I'll focus mostly on. And there we go. Our transfer and our underpainting is complete.